How did you get from there to here, Sarah? All the way from Dublin, where you were born, to London, where you were raised, married, and widowed, to South Africa, where you died. You must have wondered that frequently yourself. While you lived, you made an impression. In your obituary, the Times of London called you one of the most extraordinary women to whom the British nation has given birth. Today, though, you're hardly known at all. You certainly deserve to be. Every life is a ramble of some kind, but yours, Mrs. Heckford, was remarkable for its twists and turns, its distance in every sense, its unpredictability, its radical humanity. In your time on earth, you were given challenge, privation, loneliness, and tragedy. But what's most astonishing is how you repaid it. Not in kind, but in kindness. You were born Sarah Goff in Dublin, 1839, to parents who were also cousins. You grew up in London at various prestigious addresses. And with stints also in Dresden and Paris in the middle of the February Revolution. When you were 6, your mother died, and shortly thereafter, your older sister. Sometime after that, your father was found dead on your sister's grave, a suicide. Shortly after that, when you were 10, you contracted an infection which nearly killed you and left you lame and disfigured for life. You had a hump on your right shoulder, and on those few occasions you allowed yourself to be photographed, you tried to hide it.
When she was 21, she inherited £15,000 from her father's estate and could have, as I said, been very comfortable and wealthy in London.
We wouldn't say she was socialist now, but certainly for her day, left-wing. I mean, young ladies of her social standing didn't do the sort of things that she did.
Your station presented its own problems. You felt trapped by what you called the barriers of young womanhood. Your earliest ambition was to become a doctor. For a young lady, of course, this was quite out of the question. But in 1866, cholera struck London, and with it, opportunity.
We're talking about an era immediately after the Crimean War, and post-Florence Nightingale, when Florence Nightingale had become symbolic of the way a woman from a good family could actually do something worthwhile in the community. And there were not many outlets for well-educated women who wanted to be more than a clothes hanger, to marry and have children. So women who had a drive to make a social contribution, folks like Florence, Louisa Twining, and a number of other women had opened the door and shown that this was possible.
She saw that obviously as an opportunity to offer up her services as a lady nurse, and she's accepted as a lady nurse at the Wapping Fever Hospital, which was just east of Tower Bridge in London.
Cholera had visited London before, so the fever hospitals were quickly set up. You ministered to the sick at nights and saw at first hand the depths of suffering that were possible in the East End of London.
It was that night that she was studying Grey's Anatomy that she met her husband-to-be, Nathaniel Heckford, who was one of the doctors who was in charge of the hospital. And he encouraged Sarah with her medical studies, and he offered to tutor her in studying for her exams.
Here was a turn of events straight out of romance fiction. A doctor, dashing, young, handsome and kind, who wanted only to alleviate suffering and help you fulfill your dream. You studied at night, by candlelight, with this young man, and inevitably you fell in love.
And in 1867, they were married.
He was very good looking, I think, her husband. Yeah.
It was a storybook romance, and it should have lasted forever. Certainly, you wasted no time in beginning what was meant as your joint life's work.
And together, using Sarah's funds, they established the East London Hospital for Children and Dispensary for Women. And they bought 2 warehouses, essentially. One had been a sale loft, and this was on the Ratcliffe Highway in the East End of London.
That there were plenty of very hungry, starving, vitamin deficient, rachitic, tuberculous, fever-ridden families in the East End. When you look at the survival rates in the middle of the 19th century, the average life expectancy in the West End was about 57 years. In the East End, it was about 27 years. There was a massive difference in the disease level, the death rate. Now, in this type of situation, crowding, disease, and a certain amount of violence, sin, whatever, this was not a good place to bring up children. So the need really was there, and it was a crying need. This is an area which is deprived, immigrants coming in from Europe, Huguenots, Jewish populations, desperate poverty.
Well, certainly not where young ladies expected to live. And it was a working class area, I mean, much as it is now. She cared for people, basically, was what it came down to. For people and for children. I mean, there were children in the hospital.
The hospital that they established was the first hospital in the UK that admitted children under the age of 2.
Certainly, the children who were treated there might not have survived if they hadn't been.
Doctors tend to go where the money is. Therefore, the majority of special hospitals are established in wealthier areas where wealthy people are. Establishing a hospital in the East End, which was a poor area, was a very dicey proposition.
Dicey would have seemed to you the grossest understatement. Maintaining a hospital under the conditions you and Nathaniel endured seems, from our 21st century remove, a feat something close to superhuman. Aid came from unexpected quarters, such as an article by none other than Charles Dickens, describing his visit to the hospital, the good works he had seen performed there, and the excellent people he had met. He remains your friend for a good long time afterward. Regular fundraising events were also necessary, and you found yourself keeping company with just the sort of people you had only lately escaped. But they had their uses, and so did the Belgravia manners you had learned as a girl.
That sort of article by Dickens and connections with royalty and semi-royalty were absolutely dominant, and all of the hospitals used this in fundraising.
When I went to look for the London hospital and places, it was very difficult to track it all down. It's sort of disappeared into London's general history.
You and Nathaniel worked like ploughmen to keep the hospital running, and for a while you prevailed. Nevertheless, a toll had to be paid, and when the bill came due, it was heavier than you could have imagined. Naturally, the work of doctors and nurses carries with it obvious risks, especially in the rank and infected quarters of the poor. Perhaps Nathaniel foresaw what was to come, but even if he had, because of the sort of man he was, he wouldn't have thought to turn from that path. When the sickness came, the end was inevitable. "I have done so little," he told you in his final days, "and I had hoped to do so much, but I suppose it was worth living even to have done so little." And then, at age 29, Sarah's husband and greatest, only love was dead.
Unfortunately, in 1870, Nathaniel passed away from tuberculosis. And at that point, Sarah could have, in all probability, remained in the hospital. She helped to found a new hospital. But once again, she continued on exploring and being an adventurous. Her and Nathaniel had adopted a young orphan who had been a patient at the hospital, Marianne. And Sarah went with Marianne to Italy, to Naples, and Marianne married a lawyer. After that, Sarah went to India to help out women in India medically. And after getting a bout of malaria, she returned to London, ultimately bought some shares in the Transvaal mining, trading and farming, and had planned to become a farmer in the Transvaal in South Africa.
Africa, the dark continent. Perhaps the only place in the world forbidding enough for you to consider it a true test of your own indomitable will. The challenges began right away as your ship lay off Durban, within view of the famous Bluff Rock, and you debarked by means of a canary basket.
She had to make a journey of 450 miles up to the Transvaal. And most women in that time, no doubt, would have travelled in the ox wagon.
We'll drink that water dry, get up there, strain at your load, though you are weary.
But Sarah travelled on her pony with her pistols strapped to her side. When she arrived in the Transvaal in 1878, having travelled up from Natal, she soon found out that the shares that she'd bought in the farming company were basically a scam. At the time, the Transvaal was obviously fairly wild and uninhabited and wouldn't have been the most perfectly suitable place for what the Victorian society deemed suitable for a Victorian lady.
All of this you recorded faithfully in your diaries, every hardship, every disappointment, every fleeting joy. You wrote well and copiously, and your diaries later provided the basis for a book. You found yourself in Pretoria, knowing no one and having few prospects. At moments you despaired, but your optimism and broad-minded views helped you find the employment you by now desperately needed.
She became a governess on a farm called Nooitgedacht, close to Pretoria.
Oh, Brandy, leave me alone.
You had always pitied governesses, Sarah, and now you were a governess yourself. But you were also a hardy and adaptive woman. And when you met your employers, William and Mary Jennings, and their 2 daughters and 2 nieces, whom you were to teach, you became a good deal more comfortable.
Brandy, leave me alone. Oh, Brandy, leave me alone. Brandy, leave me alone. Brandy, leave me alone. Brandy, leave
She could have comfortably remained a governess, probably for the remainder of her life, but instead chose to push boundaries again and decided to try her hand at farming.
You grew fruit, raised chickens and sheep, and of course there were cattle.
Oh, Grandy, leave me alone. Oh, Grandy, leave.
But you had labour trouble and suffered a bout of malaria. And there was something in the air between the Brits and the Boers, the whiff of grape shot. It seemed a wiser thing to be mobile.
She tried to farm for a while and then again decided to try something new and become a lady trader. She bought an ox wagon and a team of oxen and some goods for trading and traded in the interior of the Transvaal.
Here was a genuinely revolutionary move. Traders were very common in the Transvaal. But no one had ever seen a lady trader. On an ox cart laden with goods, you travelled from mining camp to Boer settlement and past the last white outpost and into the kraals of the true Africa.
Climbing up, till I'm holding the clouds in my hand.
Trade there was excellent, and your reputation with the native peoples equally so.
Climbing up till the world is below where I stand. Climbing up to the land that I know must lie over that mountain.
But eventually you had to go back, all the way hearing rumours of rebellion soon to come.
She returned to Pretoria in 1880, just as the First Anglo-Boer War was breaking out. After the war, she was somewhat disillusioned and returned to England. And that time in England was pretty interesting. She was interested in the occult and attended seances at her friend Lady Sarah Nicholson's home. And she also published an autobiography, Lady Trader in the Transvaal. And she wrote about the hospital to raise funds for the hospital as well, and also wrote a novel.
You rattled around with your pots and pans, inspanning and outspanning night after night, trading for money where you could and barter where you could not.
In the shade of the old apple tree, when the love in your eyes I could see, when the voice that I heard like the song of the bird seemed to whisper sweet.
She resumed trading again, and her trading the second time was extremely successful. And she purchased the farm, Ravens Hill, in the Transvaal, and then invited a family of hers, Sarah Eland and Sarah's son Frank, to come out to South Africa.
And so you, your cousin Sarah Eland, and her son Frank all began the hard work of turning Ravens Hill into a farm, and more crucially, a home. You became an adept manager and a respected, almost venerated figure among the local residents. You were fierce and strong and could not have more thoroughly blasted away the barriers of young ladydom than had you used dynamite for the task. And slowly Ravenshill became the small empire you had so long wished for.
It was not like the house that Sarah was brought up in or where she'd lived in London. But I don't think that worried her. It didn't bother her at all.
Close by, there was a matriarchal tribe that had a queen by the name of Queen Majaji, who was known as the Rain Queen. And Sarah is considered to be, at the time, probably the first and only white person to be able to visit Queen Majaji's head kraal, and she became friends with Queen Majaji.
You had visited Zulu villages before, had seen the beautiful violent dances, had witnessed celebrations experienced by few Europeans before. Your neighbor, Queen Majaji, was a legendary figure in the area. The Rain Queen had inspired the famous novel, She, by H. Rider Haggard, the tale of a mysterious chieftainess of darkest Africa, at whose feet men trembled. But to you, Majaji became almost a sister, and you served informally as her advisor. The local Boers took exception to this, and with a sneer, called you Majaji's lawyer.
She was unpopular with the Boers because they thought that she was too much wrapped up with the Africans.
I can imagine Frank coming out from Ireland to South Africa with his mother to farm on Platteland, which was near Ravenshill, and to build a home at Ravenshill with Sarah. And I imagine that people living in the community were neighbours and friends, and it must have been extremely difficult when the Second Anglo-Boer War broke out, because people living in the community would have been forced to pick sides. And living in South Africa and having neighbours that were Boers, but having British allegiance would have been extremely hard.
When war broke out again, these problems grew no easier. Your own allegiances were in fact extremely complex, but your household was committed to the British side. Young Frank Eland, your cousin's boy, was in uniform in short order and destined, sadly, to become a part of history. Frank, whom you had come to know and love, as well as if he were your own son, was shot and killed in an ambush during a nighttime raid on a Boer farmhouse. dying on the steps as he attempted to rescue his captain. This led to the much more famous incident involving the revenge killings by legendary Australian commando Breaker Morant, and Morant's subsequent trial and execution. Frank was killed near Ravenshill, and he was buried there too, with a view down the hillside, and the wind in the trees sighing for another young life cut short by war. You wanted no part of war, Sarah, and planned instead for peace.
After the Second Anglo-Boer War, she actually devised a plan for educating the Boer women after the war, and returned to England and spent a couple of years preparing lectures and slides, magic lantern slides, to accompany the lectures.
She was certainly a very interesting person. South Africa, and I mean all around the empire, was very much in the news, so to speak, and written about in London.
By now, with your books, your lectures, your reports from far-flung reaches of the empire, you were something of a celebrity in London. But your health was in decline, and despite the pleas of your friends, you decided to return to the Transvaal once again. It would be the last time. You died in a small cottage in Pretoria, in the care of a nurse named Sister Faith, and all the Transvaal mourned. You were a champion of women, of children, of those who needed help and those who gave it. You were an example. You didn't always do the right thing, but you tried. And those little corners of the world through which you passed, you changed, all for the better.
There comes Alabama, Alabama over the sea. 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 Daar kom Alabama, Alabama ver oor die see. Daar kom Alabama, Alabama ver oor die see.